Yay! Who's that? Was it Cliff? Excellent. Oh, wow. Yeah, no pressure. So first of all, I want to say thank you to AtlSec for having me here again. I really do appreciate the opportunity to come down here because, well, get to see all you fine folks and also get to visit my relatives, which is always fun. What I'm here to talk to you about today is talking about zero trust, which has unfortunately become a bit of a muddy buzzword. So we're going to try and shed a little bit of light on more of a sane approach to how we talk about these things. And turns out that these remotes work better when you turn them on. So for those of you who may not know me, a little bit about myself, I have been doing information security in one form or another for the better part of 25 years. And along that line, I've made my share of mistakes, which I'm sure you've heard me say before, but that's just it. All those mistakes have been great learning opportunities. And mainly, to steal from Cliff yesterday, is about that curiosity. I have made a lot of curious mistakes that have been turned into good things for the most part, not always. And along the way, I've learned all these stories that, as I mentioned previously, these are stories that I can use to give lessons for others that hopefully won't make the same mistakes or don't need to make the same mistakes that I made. So I identify myself as a hacker. And if you go around the internet, you find out that not a whole lot of people like us too much. It's really interesting how the internet sees us in some ways. I am a very proud Canadian. And these days, that has a lot of cachet in most parts of the world, especially when you go to the Nordic countries and they assume right away that you're an American. It's like, oh, not exactly. So, case in point, this tattoo on my arm here, I got this done last summer because about 2 years ago I was in a hotel in New Delhi. And this lady, nicely dressed, walks up to me and she said, "Excuse me, are you an American?" I said, "No, actually I'm from Canada. Why?" She goes, "Good. I've never been so scared in my life." I was like, what would have happened if I had answered it any other way? So being a big fan of security and multi-factor authentication and having traveled the world, I see all these folks with Canadian flags stitched to their backpacks. I thought, I'm going to go one step further. And that's why I got to this point. So it's my own version of multi-factor authentication. And I like to point out to folks that we very much love our hockey as we go around the world, but these days we're more into golf. Too soon? But I do work for Duo, and I work there in a capacity as a Global Advisory CISO, which means I get to play the role of CISO without having to worry about all the wonderful things that all you folks have to deal with, of all the budgets and all the dealing with HR and all these fun things. And it has really been an amazing experience. My prior job, I basically forklifted it up, moved it over, and put it down in Duo. And then a few months later, this happened. And at first, I'll be honest, I had a lot of fear and trepidation. Because you go from a shop of 700 people to suddenly you're a shop of 80,000 people, it does give you a moment's pause. But this has turned out to be absolutely fantastic, especially from the Duo perspective, because things that we didn't priorly have access to, all of a sudden the world is at our feet. And this is rather amazing in that regard, because it can help us to deliver better security to our customers. And the closest thing I'll get to vendory here, the products are now available on the Cisco website. But we did miss a really key marketing opportunity with the Duo-Cisco amalgamation. We could have called it Disco. I think that would have been great, and my boss, Wendy Nather, was the one that came up with that one, so full credit to her. So the whole goal of what we do is our mission is to protect your mission. The founders of our company have a simple phrase. They like to look at it as we are working to democratize security because you want to make it as easy as possible. I would say by a show of hands how many people here have tried PGP, but I wouldn't be able to see you, so I'll just assume that there's some hands that go up when I ask that question. PGP, great product until you have to use it. And that's the problem, is there's too many folks out there that are not security minded, not technically minded, not physics superstars like we have over here. We have common users that need to be able to use security products that are going to work for them effectively. And that's just the key. We need to do a better job of this across the board. So what is zero trust? You want to know when things have changed. You want to be able to continuously verify. You want to know that all of your networks are hostile. Not know, you have to assume that. That is the one key piece of the puzzle. You have to assume that everybody's out to get you. And if you start there as your baseline, it gets easier to move forward. And the whole idea here when you're talking zero trust, it's not about ripping and replacing things. It's about using the things that you've had for the last 25, 30 years better. There are too many times that we see implementations in various companies in whatever capacity that were not done in the correct fashion. One of my favorite stories is the company I used to work for, we had 7 different network monitoring solutions installed. And I started there and I said, why is this? And then I was told that each one of these individual applications had a different feature. So I pulled all the marketing materials for all 7 of these, as well as the technical specs, and found out that each one of them did all the same things. So we really got ourselves into a hole. So we're paying 23% per annum on maintenance on products that we didn't need when we could have consolidated down. And we have all these products that over time we build up this security debt. And as we build this security debt, it compounds the problems because then when something goes wrong, it's going to go really, really wrong. And we need to make sure that we're ready for these sort of things. If you ask this entire room, what is love? You're going to get a different answer from every single person. And unfortunately, that's where the whole discussion on zero trust seems to be moving towards. So we have to do a better job of making sure we clarify the message. Too many companies out there say, zero trust is this way. Zero trust is buy this box and you're fine. Zero trust is there, checkbox, you're good. No, it's something to aspire to. It is a way to do security better and making sure that things are going to go according to plan because we know they're not going to. This is really how you should view the internet at large. And you have to understand that threats are going to come from places you really should expect, but you usually don't. And as a security practitioner, we tend to have this as the way we feel about things on a regular basis, or maybe that's just my recurring nightmare. Zero trust is a really interesting thing. So back in 2004, the Jericho Forum came out with a deprivatization paper, and it was really interesting, the whole concept, and people were like shooting it down going, not such a big deal. Others were like, oh, this is a great idea. Little did we know that it would mushroom out into being what is commonly referred to as zero trust, or as I prefer to call it, trusted access today. This is something that is basically taking all the things that we've always had, network zone segmentation, user account management, all of these different pieces, and doing them properly. John Kindervag did a great job in 2010 when he coined the term zero trust, because it put a marketing type wrapper around this concept. So many of us were like, oh yeah, we have all this stuff, we could have been doing this all along, but nobody ever had the impetus. Nobody ever wanted to do it, because let's face it, it wasn't sexy. All of a sudden you call it zero trust, people are like, hey, this kind of sounds neat. Then 2014, Google comes along with their BeyondCorp version. This was cool. This was a pivotal moment. This was their version of a zero trust methodology. And all of a sudden, more people were taking notice. They're like, okay, this has some critical mass. And to their credit, they came out with a paper later on, basically a report card on how they were doing. Now, there is a book that you can check out. I do not know these authors, nor do I have any stake in this, but this is really a cool resource if you want to learn more about this on an overall basis. This book here from O'Reilly, Zero Trust. So yes, no money gleaned from that one for me whatsoever. So the IT landscape is changing as we're going along. We're looking at ways that things that we didn't imagine 10 years ago. In a lot of companies where, this is our perimeter, this is our moat, and this is where our boxes are. And you had, database admins were holding their servers going, this is mine. But that has changed. So we have to change as well. The mobile device has become the consumer device of choice. My last job, I had a certificate on my laptop expire because, heaven forbid, I pay attention to the alerts that they kept emailing me. That would have been a good choice. Instead, iPhone for 3 days, doing meetings, doing documents, and everything until they got that whole mess sorted out and saved me from myself. But the funny thing was, I was working on my phone and I went, this is actually doable after a couple of hours of getting used to the pain and suffering of doing it differently. And I went, okay. So more and more users out there are realizing this same sort of thing. And zero trust can be used to enable that multi-cloud access as one of those things. So if you have your company is using Gmail or Azure, whatever, or Office 365, any of these products, you can use a dual access gateway as an example. There are others out there that will marshal access to these particular resources. BYOD used to be that horrible term that security folks would then spit on the floor when they heard it. It's now very much achievable. And breach prevention. This is one of those things that drives me absolutely bonkers because a lot of the breaches that we find today were imminently preventable. So with the Beyond Corp, as I was saying, this was their version of things, and they had their report card that they came out, and they talked about their experiences in 2017. And all of this is published. All of these documents are available, so I highly suggest that you go and check them out for reading. So the traditional perimeter approach of, this is my moat, this is my walls, this is my drawbridge, that really is the deprecated notion of a network today. Nowadays, zero trust is about access decisions and where they're being made. We all love our triad, so we look at this particular triad. We're talking about your apps, your devices, and your users. And when you're looking to build that zero trust methodology, you've got to start with some of the fundamentals. Like I was talking about earlier, there are some things that we have been doing for years. Confirming user identities, having an accurate source of truth for your users. One company I worked at many years ago, we did an assessment of all the user accounts in our inventory. One person on that list had left the company 10 years prior and died 5 years prior. His account was still active and had been accessed since he had left the company. These are the kind of things that are avoidable. In that case, a perfect staff add removes process would have been good. You want to be able to gain visibility as a result of having that inventory and looking at your devices, making sure that your devices, there's a uniform security across the board. I worked in companies in the past where a certain director needed access to some site so he could download pictures of kittens or something, and it was maddening because he refused to listen to any of our advice. To be fair, as a security practitioner, at that time, we were very much of the mantra, how do we get to know? That was an incredibly bad idea back then, and we didn't really appreciate it. Nowadays, we're getting closer to the idea of this is a bad idea, we can do a better job. You can then enforce contextual policies on your users once you have that uniformity across the board, and then you can secure access to the applications. If you are whatever.com and your email is mail.whatever.com and you only want your employees to access that, you can set that up through an access gateway. These are achievable today. This is one of the ultimate lessons that I learned early on in my career is castles simply don't scale. And this may sound trite, but that's the reality of it, is when you have an on-prem setup and only a certain amount of bandwidth, oh, it's okay, we have disparate pipes going through two different ISPs that just happen to terminate in the same colo hotel. Long story, been there, done that. These are the things that we got to realize, is we have to make sure that when we're building stuff, we're building it in such a way to scale. And also, just because you have that moat, you have that firewall, as Kelman will talk about later today, you don't trust something simply because it's inside your firewall. One organization I worked at, there was a great moment where I was talking and the CIO said, it's okay. We didn't have network zone segmentation. We didn't have any sort of controls on our laptops and desktops. He goes, it's okay. We trust everyone here. A novel idea, but that really wasn't something that was going to be functional. And we all like to be environmentally friendly, but one of the things that we have to make sure that we're not doing is recycling passwords. Because when the attackers compromise a site, and then they're using those credentials to go against other sites, doing credential stuffing attacks, this is something that, again, is preventable. Static passwords really have come and gone as a useful way of doing things. Because you walk up to the wall, you say, is this the password, password 1? And they'll say, no, go away. And then you go back and say, is this password 2? And you say, no, go away. And so on until you get in. Because it doesn't confirm who you are, it just confirms you have the right magic word. And when we're talking about castles not scaling and security paradigms that are just horribly broken, case in point. So before I ever got into this field, I actually did a degree in classical studies and archaeology, shock face. And one of the interesting stories from that time was the sack of Rome in 410 AD. The Visigoths came, they set up shop around the entire city and cut off all access in or out. They had a wall, they had a moat, they had a gate. Didn't help them one bit because they ran out of supplies. The Visigoths in 410 AD showed that this style of defense was horribly broken. So why do we as organizations still use this sort of approach today? And being Canadians, we like to make fun of things like going out and hiking. It's always good to be ahead of the hiker behind you because bears. But these days there are bears literally everywhere. And last time I gave this talk, there just happened to be a Russian military attaché in the audience, so that was really funny. You want to reduce the risk. This is the key piece of the puzzle. As you're going through and talking about doing zero trust, the idea here is quite simply to reduce the risk that you're exposing your organization to. Because if we don't do this sort of approach, we end up with this guy, the flaming sword of justice. So back in the early 2000s, I worked at a company and there was a guy there who his literal goal in life was to get every single person fired for any transgression whatsoever. Didn't matter what it was. Surf to autotrader.ca. Nope, he's got to go. Why? Oh, because it's not business relevant. It was absolutely insane. But this was that whole mantra of how do we get to know? And we as security professionals have to do a better job of enabling our organizations to do things better, faster, in a safe and secure fashion. Because I've been to a couple of DevOps conferences recently, and they are going out of their way to say security is not relevant. And this is a problem because they are running into these guys. And I understand why their headspace is there. This is something we can do better at. And if we don't get better at things, the data breaches are going to keep coming. And there's no shortage of these. And now I'm going to put a couple of slides up here for a couple of data breaches. And this is not to cast aspersions on these, but it's just to show that this can literally happen to anyone. There are so many data breaches out there that is absolutely mind-boggling at this point in time. So from a couple of reports here from the DBIR and IDC research. So in one case here, 81% of breaches that involve stolen or weak credentials. So sites that were compromised and then credential stuffing attacks. And then 70% of these were using compromised devices. That's a pretty staggering number, rather. And the perimeter is just that. The perimeter has melted away, or was never really there to start with. Because another organization I worked at, it was really funny. It was like, oh, okay, we have a firewall, no problem. You can't use any sort of chat protocol. So I got out one of the chat protocols at the time. I think it was Yahoo Messenger or something like that. And I tunneled it through port 80. And it worked. And he's like, you can't do that. I said, why not? I said, well, there's a firewall. And he said, evidently. And this is one of those things. It's just we have to change our thinking. We have to be curious. And the idea of the perimeter is very much something that has to change. And this is one of the lines I love stealing from my boss. The perimeter is anywhere that an access decision is being made. I used to be of the opinion that anywhere your data is. I like this definition far better. It is far more on point. The new perimeter has changed significantly. You have hyper-convenience, remote employees, and so on and so forth. And these are the things that we have to take into account. When you're looking at a zero trust model, you want to make sure you're looking at all the users in your environment. You want to make sure you're looking at the applications that you're using and the devices in your environment, whether they're BYOD or corporate assets. Now, this slide's a little bit I admittedly stole this from one of our marketing decks, but this is just an example. The idea here is with a zero trust type of model, you are using this to access resources, whether you're at home, in a coffee shop, or in the office, treating them all the same way. And to be fair, I brought up a similar type of idea in 2003 at one of the power companies I was working at, and I said, it'd be a great idea, we make bastion hosts of all the laptops, desktops, and servers. I escaped that meeting with my life just barely, because the team that would have to support it was in the room at the time, and they didn't really care for that idea. But spring forward to 2019, and here we are. Back in 2012, I started tracking data breaches on my own website because apparently I needed a hobby. And it was amazing as I went through the data here. One of the things that pops out here at the time was LinkedIn with 6.5 million records in one of their data breaches. That sounds quaint by today's standards, where we have data breaches in the order of magnitude of billions of records. And I know what I'm talking about how painful data breaches are because I've lived through one myself. In one company I worked at, this happened when I got into work the next morning. The the phone was ringing, and there was CBC and various other organizations want to have a chat with me about this particular website. And this company, we had this particular server was supposed to be taken offline 2 weeks prior to this. And we were promised, oh yes, no problem, it would be taken offline. And I couldn't get mad at the team that was supposed to take it offline because that was my error and my team's error. We didn't follow up with them to make sure it was done. This was something, again, that was imminently avoidable, and it was a mistake that I learned a very valuable lesson from. Thankfully, there was no real harm done other than reputational damage, which ultimately we survived. Now, if you look at a site called informationisbeautiful.net, I absolutely love pulling these slides out over and over again because this is a couple of years ago. It's actually closer to 3 years ago now at this point. But you get the various types of data breaches and based on their magnitude. And then you jump forward to not too long ago. Exactly, wow. This is one of the things that drives me nuts. And a lot of this is avoidable. So much so, the data breaches are so bad that the site informationisbeautiful.net had to change the way they do things, and this is how their data breaches are presented today. They had to rejig the way they did things because of this problem. So why is this relevant? Well, because there's laws and there's lawsuits. As you had Anna Manley on earlier, you can know there's all kinds of security issues. But for here, November 1st, 2018, as of that point, you have to report data breaches that are, and I have to read this because this is, here we go, real risk of significant harm. So if you have a data breach that can result in real risk of significant harm to individuals involved in that data breach, you have to report it by law. Neat thing in PIPEDA, that's not defined as to what a real risk is. Bit of a problem, but I'm sure it's something that can be remedied in time. And as we're going through and looking at all these things, all these imminently avoidable things, all these things, there's a theme. You know, passwords are really something that is a deprecated notion. Making sure that our systems are hardened or configured properly. Things that we should have been doing for 25 plus years are now biting us in the backside. And then you want to look around the neighborhood and see what's going on. So, like any good security person, I went and looked at Showdown. This is how many ports are currently open as of the last snapshot on Showdown in Canada. If I screw that down a little bit, this is Nova Scotia. Now, that's not to say that there's that many problems, but you can be guaranteed a subset of those are going to have issues. You know, might be susceptible to things like wget. Too soon? And as you're going through it and you're looking at the different things, you're seeing all these compromised databases or SSH versions and all these sort of things, and then you see things like this. There were all kinds of webcams in Canada, and this one is in Nova Scotia itself. I really am having trouble trying to understand what's so important about this particular garage door that they needed a camera, but I'm sure that's a question for another day. So we look at all these things, these low-hanging fruit that can be easily fixed, these passwords that are being an issue, all these different pieces that we can be doing a better job at protecting, and that brings us up to a zero trust network proposition. Or, as I prefer to call it, a trusted access proposition. We want to devalue the stolen credentials. So, for example, if your company is compromised and all the credentials are dumped and they're not posted on Pastebin or GitHub or whatever it happens to be, how do you know that you've been popped if these credentials are being used against you? Something to take into consideration. Low-hanging fruit, patches that could have been applied that were missed. My favorite one of all is in so many orgs in the past, Oracle patches, they came out on a quarterly release cycle, were not applied for 2 years out. And usually the answer that I got from the DBA was, it's my database, it's working fine. You want to complicate that lateral movement of the attacker if, in fact, they are able to get into your organization. You don't want them to be able to pivot through your network. Why are we going to make things easier for them? And of course, I took my Bastion host conversation from earlier and put it out of order, but this is what that would have been. So, this is a really interesting thing, is when we're looking at all these hosts and how we harden them, it's amazing what we do. We will go out of our way to harden the system that we put in the DMZ and make sure it is locked down tight, and then systems on their back-end processing have entire installs of Microsoft Office on them. Why? I asked the support team at this one particular organization why we had done that, and they said because we had it and we had a license for it, and we thought, why not? but they hadn't patched any of them. So this Tootsie Pop method of doing security is really not going to work. So if you're going to get into a zero trust discussion, you have to set expectations. Not only with your own team, but the other parts of the organization that you have to contend with. Procurement, HR, finance, all of these folks that you need to communicate with in order to get this ball moving. You want to aspire to a zero trust network because there's no zero trust certification. There's no checkbox that say, yay, I'm done. It is something that is a continually moving target. That's not to make it sound depressing, it's to be completely honest with you about it. You can get to that point, but it's an iterative process. And as we're going through and getting these incremental wins, be it an asset inventory or any sort of management of your user accounts, you need to celebrate that internally as a win. Because we're very, very, very good as security professionals about beating ourselves up. How often do we take a moment to do, a victory lap? Not that often. And what are your priorities when you're getting started? So I had a conversation at a conference recently, and there was a few people there, and I said, okay, well, where are you on the zero trust roadmap? And they're like, oh, we're already zero trust, we're good to go. And I said, okay, cool. What kind of asset inventory do you have? We don't. Okay. What kind of user management do we have? We have AD. Okay. Are the accounts all been checked in them? No. And so on and so forth. And I realized that they had just decided that they would say we were zero trust certified, or not certified, that doesn't exist, but we were zero trust, but they hadn't even done any of the work to get to that point. Now I said it before and I'll say it again because this merits repeating. If your site has been compromised and your credentials are being used against another site, or against your own site, how do you know if you haven't been alerted, or you haven't been checking? Or you have a very expensive monitoring system that you haven't looked at for 6 months. How do you make sure that the hygiene of your systems that your employees are using are up to snuff? You want to make sure you verify your users, verify your devices, and protect every application that you have to deal with. I'm going to skip past that. There we go. So, again, repetition. Trusted users. You want to make sure you're only allowing folks into your environment that are supposed to be there. You don't want King Arthur showing up and saying, I actually work here, because that's a problem. Stolen credentials. The attacker only needs to have the username and password, and these days, as we've seen from the data breach data that was on Information is Beautiful, is really plentiful. But if you have two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, all of a sudden you have then taken a stick and stuck it in the spokes of the attackers before they can get anywhere. You want to make sure you have trusted devices. So if you're using a U2F token, my brain's locking up on me, or you're using a certificate or whatever you happen to be doing in order to ensure that that device is the right device, you want to make sure that you're taking that process. And if you're doing a BYOD approach, you want to make sure that they're shunted off in a separate group. Because this is a great example of what happens if your software is not up to date. Now this is a screenshot from one of our internal decks, but this actually happened to me when I was on the road in Germany because I had not been updating my iteration of Chrome, and I had this pop up and I had to laugh because I had basically fallen on my own sword. So this is an example here where it says, okay, you have a policy that says your software has to be updated with, say, 5 days lead time in order to, from patch to application, or whatever it happens to be that's totally configurable. But this is a great example, and this has bit me in the butt in the past. With BYOD, you can enforce that. Excuse me while I take a sip of coffee. Take two. You want to be able to enforce a policy on these BYOD devices so they can come into the network. You want to make sure that they're having up-to-date software. So if they have a laptop that's running Windows ME, you don't want them in the network in any way, shape, or form. And this is a way that you can enforce that they are at a certain level of patch revision, depending on whatever it happens to be, based on your individual criteria. You want to make sure that every application that you're accessing the connections are being marshaled, so that you don't have random people at a coffee shop in Romania that are connecting to your systems that you don't expect to be attaching to them. And then you can get granular with those policies. You can lock them right down saying you can't access this or that if that's your policy or if that's your requirement, but that's just it. Any of these types of things that you look at for your environment, you want to make sure that you are doing it to satisfy your needs and your requirements. As a vendor, I'll happily sell you stuff all day long, but it doesn't do me any good if you're not happy with what you're getting, because if it's not satisfying what you're trying to achieve, what's the point, really? Having been a defender myself for 20 years, I had my share of interesting sales calls, and I know what you're up against. So make sure that you're a champion for yourself. And make sure that you're looking at your network differently as to where the access decisions are being made. So zero trust, or fix that, trusted access. Here's a really easy shopping list to get you started. Make sure that you're building out your asset inventory, addressing your user management, device management, having a uniform security policy across the board. So you don't have those random laptops that have been off the network for 2 weeks because they were off on vacation. They're running a highly vulnerable piece of software. That's something that is avoidable at this point, because then you could block them using a zero trust approach or trusted access. One of the really cool things that I always love to advocate on that you can do yourselves is building out defined repeatable processes. These are things that nobody ever wants to do, but get real value from once they're in place. So in one organization I was at, and I love telling this story, the CIO decided he was going to take the entire year off, no new projects, period. Only maintenance on current things. And we rolled out ITIL for the organization over the course of a year. At first, we all thought he had completely lost his mind, but once it was implemented, once it was running, our rate of incidents dropped 72%. We could measure it. That's pretty significant for defined repeatable processes. And that's something that you can do yourselves. And then once you get beyond that, you can start looking at things like user behavior, device behavior, making sure that you're implementing network zone segmentation. I might know a company that can help. But these are the things that are the products that can fall out of things like from a zero trust approach when you have that implemented, and you can then start reaping the benefits of the data that you're then collecting. Now, as you take these low-hanging fruit away, and you make sure that security is implemented in the same fashion across the board, then you realize the attackers have to go somewhere else. And then they're going to go after your APIs and any sort of authentication flows. And that's where we have to make sure that we're paying attention to as well. One of my favorite things was years ago, my friend Robert Hansen, he started adding all these people on Twitter to his account, and none of us had done that manually, so he just had this huge list of people that were following him, and we hadn't actually followed him on his account. He found an undocumented feature in the API, and he was able to just arbitrarily add people, and it was really interesting. But I took that as a lesson to learn for any APIs that you're dealing with, making sure that you have it properly documented and secured. Because if you don't, the attackers are going to come at you in new and exciting ways. This here is an example of a submarine cable map of all the internet connections that are available out there. And this is just one example of the many different ways the attacker can look at you. Be it coming through dial-up and MITRE, be it coming from a submarine cable, going after a package that you're incorporating into your software by a third-party developer. You have to look at all these different angles, because the idea of the hacker dropping a 0 day and trying to get into your network really is moved beyond that, where they can just take the CEO's admin out for lunch and get their password, either by whining and dining them or a brick. So, this is one of those things where you have to look at it and say, security can be done in a better fashion. Multi-factor authentication is a good thing, because you look at things like this. This was an example that I love to use, where I had a pen test done at an organization, sat down at 9 o'clock, got the calls that were starting the pen test. 14 minutes later, the phone rang again. They had already compromised the network. They had all of our routers, all of our switches, our Active Directory, all because there were default credentials on an access point from a third-party vendor into our network, bitten by the static password. These are things that can go away. Now we look at things like SSH. This is a great example. People don't regularly patch their SSH implementations. This is an example here. This is just one example from a sample that I pulled, and it had multiple vulnerabilities. Just one system in Canada. So how many people or how many SSH nodes are running in Canada? That's how many are currently available as of the snapshot that I took. A subset of those will be vulnerable and will lead to attacks in other parts where the attackers can get in and pivot. A little bit depressing, but that's why we have to make sure that we are patching our systems to current or N-1. You want to encrypt all the things. There were so many times in the past people say, oh, encryption takes up too much overhead, we can't do that. It's like all of these arguments are null and void at this point. You can encrypt your traffic at rest and in flight. We can't do it as it's being processed because homomorphic encryption, I haven't seen a good implementation of it yet. Lots of talk about it, lots of patents being out there, but I haven't seen that implemented. That being said, we can also do a better way of doing passwords. WebAuthn is something that was just ratified by W3C, where you can actually use passwordless authentication. You don't have to enter the static password anymore. This is really, really cool. And you can have that integrated with your multi-factor authentication. If you take nothing else away from my talk today, this is your homework. Go read about WebAuthn. This is an open standard. There is nothing stopping any of you from reading up on this whatsoever. This is freely available. This is going to be the next game changer, I hope. So, let's go back over this and do a little bit of a summary. Assume your network is hostile. You want to establish a trust engine. You want to make sure that you are verifying your users' devices and applications. You need to reduce that surface threat. Why do we have easy vulnerabilities out there that can lead to stuff like people iterating on a URL and getting all this data they should never have had access to in the first place? You want to continuously validate, trust but verify, and test again, and keep it simple. So, let's fix that. There we go. Repetition is something I enjoy. Build your asset inventory. Get a hold on your user management. What's on your network? There's been times in the past where I would go in to do an assessment, or as part of an organization, I say, how many Windows servers are on the network? How many Unix systems? How many this? How many that? And I would get a bunch. You need better answers than that. Your defined repeatable processes are things that you can do that are going to help reduce your pain and suffering. You're going to help remove the running around with your hair on fire. And right down to network zone segmentation. There is no reason that I should be able to sit at my desk at a financial institution that I may or may not have worked at in the past and query the mainframe directly and do all kinds of really horrible things and no one have any logging turned on for that particular connection. That shouldn't be able to happen. Not saying it did. Not saying it didn't. So back in 1962, MIT had a system called CTSS. And this was a system for allowing access to supercomputing resources where people could, I think it was 4 hours per week that they could use it. And unfortunately, people figured out that they could steal resources from other students. So they implemented this password authentication mechanism here to help marshal that access. And from what I understand, this is actually the first password implementation. There was an IBM product that came out roughly about the same time, but even IBM says they're not sure that they beat CTSS to the punch. This is something that was done in response to something as opposed to a proactive measure. Static passwords have lived their life. It is time for us to do something better. As security practitioners, we need to not be the sword of flaming justice and riding in and saying, no, there's a better way to do it. And that sword is melting away because we are doing a better job of communicating. We're doing a better job of having these conversations, of having a curiosity about what people are doing and trying to internalize and understand what they're trying to achieve. There's no need for us to throw the holy hand grenade of Antioch every time somebody goes on GitHub. That being said, I would like to thank you all for listening. And be sure to stop by the Cisco booth, because the Cisco guys are here and they'd love that. And realistically, if you have any questions that you don't want to bring up right now, feel free to contact me at any one of these particular mediums, and I'd be happy to take your help. That being said, thank you very much. Did you kill my mic? Oh, there you go. Any questions out there? If there are, I can't see you. Oh, I think I see a hand. That's Tanya, isn't it?
Will my slides be available online? If you say please, the answer is yes. There you go. Yes. Any other questions? I know I'm between you and lunch, so I'm okay if you run.
All right, thanks again.